All right, so welcome everyone to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Q&A. Our guest today is J.P. Marceau, who is the editor-in-chief of Jonathan Pageau's Symbolic World blog. Thank you, J.P., for being here today.
Thanks for the invitation, guys.
Yeah, so you got involved with you're involved. You're involved with Jonathan's Symbolic World. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got interested in symbology, how you met John, and how you got into all of this.
Yeah, sure. What happened? The initial story is fairly typical of a lot of people in the West. Was raised in a Catholic household. Got away from it during my high school years as I became more scientific, I would say. Got interested in philosophy to try and find how meaning could possibly fit into my scientific worldview. So I eventually got away from scientism, went into panpsychism more precisely because I thought it offered the best stepping point away from materialism and scientism. And in the course of doing this, I was studying doing a master's in philosophy to try and approach these questions more precisely. And it was around the time when Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and also John Vervaeke started to come onto the scene. So this would be like late in 2016, I think. And at first, I didn't really understand what Jonathan was saying, really. And I had that even trouble understanding how what Jordan Peterson was saying could be real in a metaphysical sense, how it wasn't just psychology. But anyways, I was sort of working with all of that stuff. And eventually, when Jonathan started his Patreon, I started to support him, and I had the chance to have a few phone calls with him fairly early on. So I asked him, I talked to him a bit about the research I was doing in my master's in philosophy of mind, especially in Psychism, and trying to see how it could possibly bridge with his sort of symbolic worldview. So I was interested to see how his symbolic worldview was getting at something real, how it wasn't, let's say, just studying patterns in our minds, how it wasn't just telling us about the structures of human consciousness, but how it was talking to us about the actual nature of the world, of reality. And so over time, I got a clear understanding of what metaphysics would make a symbolic worldview possible. And as I was doing this, I was also trying to use the symbolic worldview to solve some issues. Really cool one that I dealt with Jonathan was the zombie problem. Both John and Jonathan have done great work on that front to lay out how it is that the zombie is a symbol of nihilism. It's a symbol of, you can see it as creatures that are cut off from meaning, that have only the simulacrums of meaning. They're sort of a community, but they don't talk with one another. They don't have profound meaning making with one another. They just sort of follow the same group as a mindless herd. They don't even have speech, like the capacity for logos. They don't have that. They have our brains, like the very organ that we use to mediate between meaning and matter. So there are a lot of reasons why zombies are a good symbol for nihilism. And then I wanted to know, in addition to, let's say, the solving philosophically the problems of nihilism, or even addressing them practically with, let's say, the sort of practices that John has been talking about, developing communities and practices to fight nihilism and the meaning crisis. I also wanted to know with Jonathan, what would be a symbolic solution to the zombie problem? Like without having to get into philosophy or even practices, like within a symbolic worldview, what would be a solution to the zombie problem? And this was relevant to me because as I was working through this in the case of my studies, I was having recurrent zombie nightmares, a way to see it is that as I was processing during the daytime, the arguments for nihilism and trying to get away from it, I was also sort of wrestling with the same issues symbolically at night. I was having just recurring nightmares about the zombie apocalypse. There's always a zombie apocalypse in my dreams, just never ending. I would just, at some point I would die, and then I would wake up from my dreams, and then I would just go back to another zombie nightmare. It wasn't as bad as it seems, actually, because at some point you just get used to it, and I sort of knew that I would just resurrect and start over. So it's not as bad as it sounds, but I was still curious to see what I could possibly do to solve that problem. And actually, my studies really helped by going from materialism to panpsychism. My zombie nightmares were already cut off quite a bit, because you can see it as infusing consciousness back into zombies instead of having just material creatures that follow the laws of physics or whatever. You put consciousness back into that. You put emotions, sensations, and so on into the zombies. So it's already an improvement over the zombie crisis, over the meaning crisis. So this was already cut off my nightmares, and then looked into ethics and was fairly convinced by people like Jonathan Haidt and also St. Thomas Aquinas, who have good theories about ethics, about how it could relate to the world. So in addition to having consciousness back into my worldview and fighting the zombies that way, I was also reinserting morality, vices and virtues in my worldview. So this again cut off the zombie nightmares, but it wasn't completely cut off. But in discussing the problem symbolically with Jonathan, we found the solution of it's basically the Christian solution, because you can see zombies also as just a perversion of the Christian story. I think both John and Jonathan have said this. Instead of having a resurrection, as Christianity claims, of the dead who come back with glorious bodies, who come back like fully alive, you come back but without meaning in the case of zombies. And the symbolic solution within the Christian worldview is to not only build meaning, not only build meaningful civilization, but to actually do what Christ would do, to give your life over to try and save everyone, so even the zombies. And as Jonathan and I discussed this and found the symbolic solution, my zombie nightmares completely went away. So that was interesting. Made me take symbolism a bit more seriously. And over time, I kept in touch with Jonathan. We met once met at his parish. He met me once also just before COVID, actually, at my parish, and we still talk often, as in a webinar for his some of his top level patrons. So that's how I got in touch with Jonathan. And recently, we started the Symbolic World blog to try to create a community where we explore symbolism and try to develop that worldview. So that's on the side of Jonathan. And with John, it actually comes from a discussion I had with Paul Vanderklay about a year ago now, because I had been following John's work for a while. At some point, I think maybe in 2016 or 2017, Jordan Peterson had tweeted about John's work, the fact that John had put up some lectures online. It was I think those were the Buddhism and Cognitive Science lecture series. And I had quite liked those. I actually used them when I was doing a course on phenomenology for my master's. So I was a bit familiar with John's work, and I knew that Paul Vanderklay was going to talk to John. So I mentioned John's work when talking with Paul, and proposed panpsychism as at least a first step to address the meaning crisis. And John heard about this, and we ended up having a discussion about it, and it was a really cool discussion. We both learned from it, so we ended up having several others. I think by now we've spoken like 5 or 6 times, and we're still gonna have discussions in the future. I think we've mostly been discussing metaphysics, and especially the place of Christianity and of Neoplatonism. So that's how I've been in contact with John.
Great. So sorry, Strong. Can you mute? Sorry, I'm gonna. Sorry, we had some static there. Okay, so you talked about there are a lot of things you talked about. So you talked about the symbolic worldview. What is a symbolic worldview?
Yeah. the way I like to put it is a symbolic worldview is a worldview where you try to explore the relationships between the different levels of being. So I think it's best to give examples when we do this. An example I like to use all the time is the symbol of the head, like as in a head over a body. If you just think about your head is a symbol of your mind, and it mediates between your body and your mind. And we don't have to get into the precise metaphysics of what is the exact relationship between mind and matter. The point is just that when you can take your different members, you have hands, you have eyes, and so on, spread over space and time, who do all kinds of concrete things, and somehow all of the information that it's your ears, your retina, your hands, and so on, they're gathered up into they're gathered up by your head, and somehow they will become abstracted into conscious patterns. So we can take the example of as I heard you talk, Brett. Tons of stuff occurred over my eardrums, tons of vibrations. Then they got routed up to through my brain, and there something happens. We don't have to get into the precise metaphysics, but somehow these meaningless oscillations on my ear, somehow they became related to my consciousness, to a pattern. I heard words and sentences. So you have an abstract pattern of a sentence that became abstracted from the concrete level of my physical being. And conversely, when I speak, as I speak these words, for instance, I'm taking abstract patterns in my mind. I'm taking sentences with words, with meanings, and so on, and I'm unfolding this through my mouth, through my lungs, into concrete oscillations in space and time. So my mouth and my lungs will move in very complex ways that look meaningless at that scale, at the scales of just waves over the air. But what is at this physical level just oscillations and activities in my cells is actually a manifestation of the more abstract pattern in my mind. So to come back expressively to symbolism, symbolism is the study of mediators between levels of being, such as what I just went through. My head is a symbol that mediates between my physical layer, between the cells in my eardrums and the cells over my mouth and in my lungs. The head mediates between those cells, those concrete cells in space and time, and the abstract pattern in my consciousness. And symbolism is about studying those jumps, those symbols that mediate between levels of being at all levels. So this works you can look at it at lower levels. What I just said about my head and my body is also true if you look at what happens in a cell, for instance. In a cell, you have tons of different organelles that are spread over space and time, doing all kinds of chemical interactions very quickly that can be meaningfully gathered in when they reach the nucleus into information. They will be gathered up into genetic information. So what was just, let's say the mitochondria is having a certain issue, and they release certain enzymes. Eventually, those enzymes will have complex relationships with the nucleus, where the nucleus will gather these seemingly meaningless enzymes, and it will gather them into information, into the genetic information of the nucleus, and then this will, let's say, react by creating certain other enzymes to fix whatever was going wrong with the mitochondria. So you have a physical artifact, the nucleus, that mediates between the physical layer of the chemicals in the cell and the abstract genetic information of the cell, the old pattern of the cell. So the cell holds together because the nucleus provides a certain pattern that it can then mediate through to the different organelles in the cell. So a way to see it is that the organelles provide matter for the patterns of the cell, and the patterns of the cell keep the different materials of the organelles together. So what the relationship that holds between my physical layer and the layer of my consciousness is analogous to what happens at other levels of being, such as what happens in a cell, where you can see the what my head does to my body is sort of what the nucleus does for the organelles. And we could also look at higher levels of being. The same thing happens in a church, for instance, or just in a community. We can take even this recording right now. You can see that Brett is a mediator between the community as a whole and its individual members. Rather than having just, let's say we're 15 people in this chat, rather than having 15 people doing their own separate thing all over the place, we're gathered up into a community by Brett, who invited me and then invited all of you guys, so that today we enact the pattern of the community where we get together, we speak certain things, we type words into a certain chat, and this makes us a group. And a group is an abstract entity when you think about it. It has, it exists at a higher level than just the individuals, but it's a real thing. We really are behaving as a group right now. And in the same way that my head mediates between my consciousness and my body, well, you can see that Brett is mediating between the community that exists as a whole and the individual members. So symbolism, to conclude, is the study of the symbols that mediate between those layers of being.
And how would you differentiate between a symbol and an analogy or a metaphor?
That's a good question. Well, how would you define, for instance, an analogy or a metaphor?
I mean, I tend to think of a metaphor as something that you're describing in a way that that evokes the thing you're describing, but is not the thing you're describing.
Okay, yeah. I think the difference will have to do with participation. Let's say if I take my head, for instance, my head really does participate in my my mind and my body. It is a member like my other members, but it also participates in my mind. And I'm not sure that the same would be true of metaphors or analogies. For instance, if I take, so what metaphor did you use as an example, Brett, already?
Oh, I don't think I did. I mean, the metaphor.
Okay.
Like or captaining a ship, going through the waters, could be a metaphor.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I don't think it's that different. So captaining a ship. I mean, it's an expression. I don't know how. I'm not sure it's a. Let's take another example. Because I'm not sure it's even really a metaphor. I think it's just the expression. Maybe it's because I'm not familiar enough with the English language, but isn't this what captain means exactly? To be the leader of a ship. It's like being the head of a ship, and it's true that the captain is the head of the ship. So in that case, I would tend to. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I think the metaphor would be that Brett is captaining the ship of discord.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, then I guess you could say that analogies or metaphors are things that you use to get at symbols. So let's say the idea that Brett is captaining the ship of discord is you use a certain image, you use a certain perceptual machinery that we have of we can recognize a captain and a ship, and we have perceptual machinery to recognize this, to get at the pattern of a captain over his ship, and we can use this metaphor to map it onto let's say the case of Brett and the discord, and this allows us to get at really the symbolism, the fact that in both cases you have the captain of the ship is the head of the ship, and Brett is the head of the discord. So maybe a way of seeing it is that whether you use metaphors or analogies, they will work because they will work when they get at symbols that are analogous between those different layers of being. So, yeah, does that answer the question?
Yes. So I want to talk about this. So you wrote a blog post recently about the burning of cell towers, and you were discussing it with John. And
Yeah.
so you were describing the symbolism of the cell towers as representing, the COVID crisis and in their role in allowing people to move, keeping people more docile, and just you identified just a variety of different ways in which the cell tower is a symbol of COVID, and you talked about the people burning down cell towers, but blaming it on 5G, on the physical. And you noted that that you thought these people were keying into the symbol, even if it didn't occur to them in the first place. And so I guess I have a few questions on this, but you almost seem to be describing an objectivity to symbols. Do you think symbols are objective, that they arise objectively, or are they a part of our own minds, our own interpretations of various things?
That's a good question. The word objectivity is fraught with all kinds of debates in philosophy, but let me say that I do think that symbols are real and that they're not just a let's say fabrications of our mind. I do think that the fact that, let's say, the nucleus mediates between the genetic information and the organelles is real. I think it exists. I think the nucleus really does mediate between those two. I think that your head really is a symbol of yourself, that it really mediates between your body and your mind. So I don't think we're projecting this. I think we're really getting at that something that actually holds the world together. There really is a unity between the organelles in a cell and its genetic information. So I think we're getting at something real when we talk about the nucleus as a symbol for the cell. And similarly, there really is a relationship between your mind and your body. We don't have to even get into the precise metaphysics, but definitely the head has a role, and as an important role in this. It's not just a fabrication. We really are getting at something real.
So can somebody be right or wrong in how they interpret a symbol?
Yeah, you can. If you try to identify something that isn't really mediating between those layers as you say it is, then you're wrong. For instance, in the case of the cell towers, maybe the people who so people have a good intuition to start off from. They intuit that cell towers did play some role in the COVID crisis, and as you said, I mentioned a few. I don't think it's necessary to go over all of them now, but let's say cell towers allow the government to communicate and send information to us. They allow people to panic on social media and to hunker down. So cell towers did participate. They did mediate between the social layer and they did mediate between a social level panic and the physical world. So they are a physical artifact in a physical world that also has a social import that played the role within the social panic. So they're a symbol because they mediate between the social layer and the physical layer. But if you say that they do so at a physical level, that they do so because the way they mediate between the COVID crisis and the physical level is because 5G technology causes the coronavirus or makes it worse somehow, then I think you're misidentifying the symbolism that is going on. So the cell towers really do mediate between the crisis and the physical layer, but you can misidentify the way in which they do so by claiming, for instance, that it's all just a physical thing and not rather a social phenomenon.
Now, so do you think symbols can be created, or are they discovered, or both?
That's a good question. Let's say we can try to think even about, let's say, the world before there was any cell, like before any sort of life. There's a sense in which the pattern of, let's say, a human liver cell, this pattern already existed in the abstract. It was simply not manifest yet. It became manifest when cells first appeared. So I think that's a start. When we get to the human level, I think we can get at we can discover good symbols. Yeah, I think it's much more of a discovery than a creation. If you try to create a symbol, maybe maybe the first person who maybe we can try to think of well, I can just even take churches, for instance, or any building that holds people together. Okay, so the church mediates between a community and its individual members. So in that sense, people created it. There was a time when there was no church, and then there was a church. But it's not that people created the pattern, and then from then on, it was from then on it existed. I think it's more that the abstract pattern already existed, and then it became manifest when people actually built churches. Another way to see it maybe is in case of, I think it's similar to a bunch of other debates in philosophy having to do with the reality of certain entities. I think it's the same thing with mathematics. For instance, in the recent decades, people have been creating, you can say people have been discovering all kinds of theorems in mathematics that weren't known before, but were able to create all kinds of crazy machines with them. Like we can build atomic bombs, which is a new thing, and which allowed certain mathematics to manifest themselves for the first time in human history. But it's not like those patterns wouldn't have existed without human beings to discover them. They were already real. They were simply not manifested yet.
So we're here in the, in this forum, we're trying to sort of talk about the religion that's not a religion. Are you familiar with John's concept of that?
Yeah.
So one thing we're interested in is what symbols would be representative of the religion that's not a religion. So what should we be thinking about as we're trying to identify sort of maybe even new symbols to identify, to associate with this movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, because as I said, I think we have to tap into patterns that already exist. We don't really create symbols, I think. So I would, and I think you're already doing this. If you study the symbols that have been effective in other systems, it will tell you about how to mediate between those different layers. For instance, if you study the way in which certain communities can come together around the symbol of a church, how different people can become an actual community, when they come into a building and they do certain things. This will help you understand how you can sort of craft your own symbols, how you can find those ways to map between the community and the individuals. So that's all I could really say. Symbolism it's something you have to practice, and with this practice, you get better at spotting symbols and spotting also symbols that emerge. For instance, the idea that cell towers cause or somehow make the coronavirus worse is a symbol that emerged, and people who burn down cell towers don't seem really conscious of what of the symbolism of what they're doing exactly, but it's still something that emerged. And if you practice seeing the world symbolically, you'll be able to identify those patterns that emerge, and you'll be able to foster the ones that are useful. So maybe you'll see, let's say in the case of this Discord, if you see that this Discord is holding people together, bringing them into a community that unites people. You can see that then this discord is a symbol of the symbolism. Of the religion that's not a religion. It's bringing different people into the religion that's not a religion. So you can try to spot this and foster this. But I think more than anything, symbolism is a practice where you have to get better and better at identifying the symbols that emerge and fostering the ones that work best.
Thank you so much. I want to move to questions. Now, we have a couple questions on panpsychism. So could you just, before we get to the questions, could you tell us what is panpsychism?
Yeah, panpsychism is a theory in philosophy of mind that has been gaining a lot of steam in the last 3 decades, I would say. It was also pretty popular about 100 years ago, but the reason why it's coming back is that it's a neat way to get over the faults of materialism. So most panpsychists will argue that first, materialism does not explain consciousness. It does not explain phenomenal experience. For instance, the blue of my disk is not something that I can get at if I just look at matter as physical science describes it. This problem has been formulated very well by David Chalmers about 25 years ago. Made it really clear in his book, especially the Conscious Mind. And if you want to, I can go over some of the arguments later, but I think I'd rather go over that quickly and get to panpsychism. Just the basic idea is that more and more people agree that the world as described by physical science doesn't allow you to talk about your consciousness, doesn't allow you to talk about phenomenal experience, like the blue that you see, the pain that you feel, the emotions that you feel, and so on. And the solution that has been gaining steam is panpsychism, which it solves the problem in a very elegant way. There are a few arguments for this. I'm gonna try to give just the main one that explains panpsychism well, at the same time as it argues for it. If you look at the entities described by physical science, you never actually get to the nature of those entities. You only ever get how those entities behave. If you take an electron, for instance, physical science can tell you how the electron behaves. Like, it can give you laws that describe how the electron interacts with other electrons or with protons and so on. But it doesn't tell you why the electron does this. It never tells you the intrinsic nature of the electron. Even, let's say, the fact that physical science gives you the mass and the charge of the electron, it still doesn't really tell you the nature of the electron, because saying that the electron has this mass and that charge only tells you that if you plug this mass or that charge into that equation, you'll get that output. So symbolism only ever, physical science only ever gives you the behavior of things and doesn't give you their nature. So that's the one side of things. And now, the clever insight of panpsychism is to try to fill that ontological void in physics by putting consciousness in there. And you actually start by doing this at the human level. If I look at Brett, for instance, I can look at Brett at the purely physical level if I want to. I can say that, okay, well, Brett is a very complex set of fundamental particles. And I can use the laws of physics to predict what Brett will do. He will behave in such and such a way. I can even predict maybe that at 3 o'clock Eastern time, he will get into the Discord server and start a conversation with JP and a bunch of John Verwicke enthusiasts. Maybe I can explain this physicalistically, but it's only really a superficial explanation. It only explains Brett's behavior in terms of the behavior of more fundamental particles. Doesn't give you the intrinsic reason for any of those things. Doesn't give you the intrinsic nature of Brett or the intrinsic nature of his fundamental particles. So the insight of panpsychism is that, but we actually do have a great candidate for the intrinsic nature of Brett, or for the real reasons of his actions, namely his consciousness. It was because of his desire to have this conversation here that Brett logged into the Discord at 3 o'clock Eastern time. So you identify the intrinsic nature of Brett's of Brett's body with his consciousness. And the trick in panpsychism is to do the exact same thing at all the different layers of the physical ontology. So the reason why cells behave the way they do is, well, because they have a certain conscious nature. The reason why molecules behave the way they do is because they have a certain conscious nature. The reason why fundamental particles behave the way they do is because they have a certain conscious nature. And then the trick in panpsychism is to try and study how is it that, let's say, my consciousness can be the combination of smaller consciousnesses. But the reason why this is convincing to a lot of people right now is that it allows you to keep your materialist ontology wholesale. You can still say that, okay, electrons really do exist, so do cells, molecules, and humans, and so on. You can keep your materialistic ontology, but you add consciousness in there, and this allows you to kill two birds with one stone. You can fill the ontological void of physics at the same time as you explain the hard problem of consciousness, at the same time as you give a place for consciousness in nature. So that's why that's the basic idea for panpsychism, and that's also why it's been popular in the recent decades.
All right, thank you. So with that, let's turn to Skylar, who has a question. Are you there, Skylar?
I think he's typing.
Oh, he wants me to read it. Oh, please read. Yeah, just around. If you want me to read it, please ask me at the top to read it. So his question: would you please steelman the critiques you have heard of your panpsychist perspectives, and also provide insight on what it is you gain from this point of view? I love the fractal patterns of masculine, feminine, dark light, silent sound that you seem to be immersed in. I hope that this may help frame why it is we could use you in these conversations. Thank you also for the cell tower burning videos. Very helpful.
Yeah, a good question. The best critique of panpsychism comes from William James. It's the combination problem. How is it that different consciousnesses can combine? Because this is at the heart of panpsychism. If you really want to claim that human consciousness is a combination of, let's say, the consciousnesses of human cells, then you need to give an account of how it is that different consciousnesses can combine. And this is widely recognized as the most important problem for panpsychism. And it's not clear that even if you stay within, let's say, modern analytical philosophy of mind, there doesn't seem to be really great solutions to this. But what has happened, I think this answers your second question, like how can this provide insight on what it is that I gain from this point of view, is in trying to address the combination problem as it is expressed in modern analytic philosophy of mind, I had to look backwards in time to authors who give, I think, good answers to this, and it ended up bringing me closer and closer to Neoplatonism. So to make a long story short, the relationship between the one and the many within panpsychism, of how many consciousnesses can be united in one consciousnesses, is sort of the same problem as what philosophers have been dealing with since maybe Plato, of how it is that different things can somehow be one. And it's something that has been, something that has become clearer in the course of my several discussions with John Vervaeke, especially in Christian Neoplatonism, or also in Eastern philosophy. Like you can see this in Buddhism and also in modern cognitive science. The solution to the problem of the one and the many, and which ends up being also a solution to the combination problem in panpsychism, is sort of a combination of a worldview that is just emanation or just emergence, and you have to identify both. So rather, I can try to maybe go quickly through those two. A purely emergentist worldview would be sort of just a bottom-up worldview, and this has several problems. So a purely emergentist worldview would be, let's say, you have fundamental particles, and then you have laws of physics that govern those, and somehow complex things emerge from the combination of those particles. And This has the advantage that you can sort of understand the different building blocks of things, and it seems to give you something really solid. But it has a huge problem that it ends up making emergence sort of into a miracle. Like, how is it that different things could possibly combine into something one? Like, and this point has been made powerfully by different people in different ways. One of the ways I like to put it is just consider two things spread in space and time. Something that it's an example that Henry Bergson used. Let's say, how is it that two planets, for instance, that are separated in space and time by thousands and thousands of kilometers? How is it that they can interact with one another? How is it that things that are separate can somehow relate? How is it that different things can somehow be one if you just take sort of their individual constituents? So that's a problem if you want to be just a purely emergentist. You can look at more complex examples, like the fact that somehow the human mind emerges from matter looks like a miracle if you're a purely emanationist. But conversely, if you try to take the other way around of taking a purely immanentist worldview, something like what the Neoplatonists did, you have just the opposite problem. You take the fact that, okay, well, somehow it's the unity of things that is primary, and there emanate multiplicity from it. So to come back to, let's say, the example of the planets, it would be somehow like the whole of the gravity plus the planets that exists, that is sort of the source of it all. And from this emanates the differences between the two planets and the space between them, for instance. But this sort of pure Neoplatonism also has issues because it's not clear why emanation would work. You sort of have emanation ends up looking like a miracle. Like, why does the one somehow decay into the many? And the solution that has sort of emerged through my discussions with John is to combine both. That's what the Christian Neoplatonists did. That's also what I think Buddhism is getting at, and it's what modern cognitive science argues for. I think you have a deep interpenetration of both emergence and emanation at the same time. We can look at the world from both directions, and we sort of don't get quite to the whole picture, but by identifying both, we end up with a reasonable system. So in the case of the brain, what seems to happen is that both emergence and emanation are perfectly simultaneous. There are two ways of looking at the same phenomena. Let's say, as I speak these words, for instance, if you were to look at my brain bottom up, you would see all kinds of different cells firing in all kinds of different ways, and at some point they fire into a certain network, and somehow at some point you get self-organizing criticality where this whole network will shift in a extremely surprising way that looks kind of miraculous, where just like one neuron will shift just a bit in a way that will make the whole network reconfigure extremely quickly into one other network. And if you were to look at at the same thing going on top down of how my thought progresses, when I had a certain neural network configuration, I was thinking a certain thought, and then I thought a different thought, and this corresponds to another neural network configuration. And this shift that I look at the level of consciousness is sort of one, it's simple, and at the same time as this abstract thought incarnates itself into different neural networks, as my thought emanates into the many neural networks, you have a simultaneous, an identical, just a second, different way of looking at the same thing. You have a simultaneous emergence of the different neural networks with all kinds of complexities, the emergence of all those into one simple thought. So that's where I got from taking the Steelman critique of panpsychism seriously. I got sort of further away from the modern versions of panpsychism that don't incorporate any Neoplatonism, and I ended up enriching my worldview because of this.
All right, great, thanks. That was a great answer. Struan has a question. So we concocted a symbolic solution to the zombie crisis. What do you make of it? So here's what they've proposed. What is the problem with a zombie? No soul. How do you ensoul a zombie? Soul food. What's soul food? Mana. What is the philosophical concept that attaches to mana? Potential. How do you save a zombie? Confront them with their own transjectivity, because that reveals to the zombie their own potential, and through the exposure, they can no longer remain zombies.
Interesting. I'll have to reread this and think about it. So what is the problem with a zombie? No soul. How do you ensoul a zombie? Soul food. What's soul food? Mana. What's the philosophical concept that attaches to mana? Potential. How do you save a zombie? Confront them with their own transjectivity, because that reveals to the zombie their own potential, and through the exposure, they can no longer remain zombies. I don't know. I think I would need more details. I find it difficult to imagine what this means exactly.
And I think Struan's Mike, or is anyone else here who was involved? There are a few people I think involved with crafting that, but I'm not sure if they're online. Or maybe Struan, you could see if someone is around who has a mic and who can come in and give some elaboration. So
it's especially the first steps that I would like to see some argumentation for. Like when you go from, I think I agree with the first idea. Like, what's the problem with a zombie? No soul. But then I'm not sure about the soul food thing, or the mana, or the move from mana to potential. Yeah, but I do think there's something good about the move to participation, to transjectivity, because I've heard John say that the solution to the meaning crisis is building a meaningful civilization, and this goes in part with transjectivity, with like building communities. Where I do know that when I dealt with this issue symbolically with Jonathan, so Christianity goes a bit further, because you don't just try to build a meaningful civilization, but you also like try to save the zombies even themselves. So there, yeah, and this does have to do something with participation and transjectivity, because in some sense you would have to do what Christ did. We would have to like somehow die for the zombies. Don't know how much this maps with what you just drawn.
I might be able to play with this a little bit. It might be slightly off the point of Strawn, but as far as like the how do you ensoul a zombie, and the answer being soul food, I noticed that there seems to be a parallel there to what you were bringing up earlier with the cell towers, in that seemingly the zombie is having a confusion of what the symbol represents. So, right, the question might be, why do zombies eat flesh?
Yeah, that's good.
And it seems like what they're trying to eat is they're trying to ensoul themselves, except that they've confused the symbol of what a soul is to being a body, or being flesh, or being the brains, right? They eat brains. So it does seem like there is some aspect of this kind of symbolic confusion taking place, where the zombie is trying to find that way to integrate the soul, and is confused in the way of going about it.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Thank you. What's your name, by the way?
Nick.
Oh, thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think that's very enlightening. Yeah, I agree. And this makes the move to transjectivity clearer as well. You can see the move within John's lecture series, where from a worldview with the ancient Greeks, where transjectivity was accepted and played an important role, to the modern self, where we isolated ourselves more and more, where we sort of became trapped within our own minds, our own persons, where we cut ourselves off from the world, from others, and even from ourselves, from our own bodies. And the zombie metaphor is very apt in that, as you said, the brain is a symbol for the mind, is a symbol for meaning, but the zombie eats it just at the physical level, you can say. It doesn't get to the social, the transjective nature of our souls. And then I'm not yet. So then I would agree with that move, that you have to confront the zombie with like a better symbol. You have to show the zombie that the desire to eat the brain, to eat meaning, starts from a good intuition that the brain has something to do with meaning, but is misdirected and sort of falls back to the physical layer of the brain, rather than looking at how the brain is a symbol that links individual bodies to communities, like how it links you as an individual physical person to other people, and that in this relationship you become mindful. In that relationship you become like a soul, that you develop your personality. We wouldn't even have personalities without other people. We need, especially during infancy, to be confronted with others for our minds to become real, for our personalities to form. So I agree with that we would need somehow to recover this for the zombies, to confront them with transjectivity. I guess I would, then my last question would be about the potential, which I'm not, I guess I'm not sure how you would even need the potential step.
And Nick, you had a question of your own, actually.
Yeah, I did. So I was wondering if and you perhaps kind of answered this in an earlier question, in the difference between the emanation and the emergence, but I'll ask it anyways and see if it helps. Does your panpsychism lead to a more of a pantheist view, kind of in the sense of Spinoza, or a panentheist view? And if the latter, do symbols have access to that aspect that extends beyond the creation?
Okay, good question. I don't think that panpsychism by itself entails either pantheism or panentheism. It has been common for panpsychism. Actually, I mean, both have been occurring in the last century. It was a fairly common move when there was sort of a first wave of panpsychism about 100 years ago, with Arthur Eddington, Bertrand Russell, Henry Bergson, and some of them. I should also mention Whitehead. Some of them were quite fond of moving to a version of pantheism or panentheism, but I don't think you have to necessarily go that route. You can also maintain that, so panpsychism explains how different consciousnesses can combine, how it is that when you have let's say the meeting of emergence and emanation, you get something like consciousness, whether the meeting occurs within a nucleus in a cell, or whether it happens in a mind, whether it happens in the head of a body, or whether it happens, let's say, in the priest of a parish. You can see at this meeting of two layers of being, you would get consciousness, like somehow like consciousness is what mediates between those layers of being, and that symbols point to conscious things. You can make that move. Not all panpsychists will do so. Recently, especially the last wave of panpsychism, most panpsychists haven't made the move to even higher than human level consciousness. Most panpsychists today would say that, there is consciousness at the level of fundamental particles, and they can combine into more and more complex ones until you reach the human level, but after this it's sort of finished. So you can get this as well. And then if I want to talk about, say, pantheism or panentheism more directly in terms of how this fits within religions, I think it's quite possible to say that beyond all of this emergence and emanation that we see within the modern world, within the natural world, there may be still some, like, a ground of being behind all of this, from which, like, somehow both the emergence and the emanation come from. So I don't think that panpsychism needs to entail either pantheism or panentheism. You see a broad array of views. And I'd still like to answer the last questions. Do symbols have access to that aspect that extends beyond the creation? And I think the answer for this is yes. You'll find this in most spiritual traditions, where you have in Buddhism it's the Buddha. In Christianity it's Christ. You have someone that acts as a symbol to unite divinity and humanity. It's different between Buddhism and Christianity. In Christianity, God is personal and incarnates fully in a person that is man, that is Jesus Christ. Whereas in Buddhism, it's the non-being of Buddha. It's his participation as a man into the non-being, into the emptiness that allows him to reach from human to divine. But in both systems, you have a symbol that unites the created world, a man in the created world, to the uncreated, to what is beyond creation. Does that answer the question, Nick?
Right. Yeah, that's a good answer. And just to clarify slightly, I was more curious about your specific take on panpsychism than panpsychism in general. But I take the point that from a purely emergent perspective, you can very easily sidestep either pantheism or panentheism.
Okay. Oh, but I can try to answer better your question then. Thank you. The way I like to see it is within my panpsychism, especially within Christianity, it's I like to distinguish between pantheism up and pantheism down. And I think pantheism down is a bad kind of pantheism where you try to pull divinity down to humanity with your pantheism. You try to just say that, okay, well then the totality of creation is God. I don't think that's a valid move, because it leaves you with all kinds of questions that are actually quite clear if you go back in philosophy to, let's say, the ancient Greeks or the medieval philosophers. It doesn't answer the question of the ground of being. It doesn't answer the where does creation come from. So, but clearly you have within either Christianity or even within Buddhism the desire for a sort of pantheism up, where creation is meant to participate in God, but doesn't quite do it, and creation will never exhaust. No matter how well it participates in God, it will never fully express God, but God is still drawing creation into himself. So within Christianity, this occurs with Christ, who, let's say, became a man and then gathered people, died, founded the church, and then the church has been expanding. And in doing so, the ultimate purpose is for all of creation to be united under the Logos, under the divine principle, under Christ. So the goal is to raise creation to God. So it's not a naive pantheism that just identifies creation with God. It's rather an aspiration for creation to be united with God. And you get the same sort of thing in Buddhism, where the Buddha is supposed to draw people into participation to the ground of being, which is impersonal in that system. But still, the goal is to draw creation into emptiness, into non-being.
Right. So would you say it's fair to characterize that as panentheism?
Well,
because it seems like you're hinting towards something that is beyond merely the creation.
Yeah, I think you will have to. Can you give me a precise definition of panentheism? Because all of those terms are so fraught with debates right now that I'd like to know precisely how you see it.
I guess with panentheism, I'm thinking of perhaps a classic idea that God is fully present within the creation, but also extends beyond it.
So you say fully present in the system. I'd say this gets closer, but yeah, I would have to look more precisely into the arguments against this view, because I know there are lots of arguments against. There's lots of opposition, I should say, rather than arguments to this within religious circles, whether they be Eastern or Western. So I'd be more careful, and I wouldn't want to clearly say panentheism.
Right.
That sound fair?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I can't answer more precisely, but yeah,
no,
that's just
not at all.
Too at the topic. You're welcome.
Thanks. Tyler, go ahead.
Oh, I was just kind of being cheeky, but yeah. I was just talking about self and how strange the symbol of self is, because in what Gödel showed us, I think, in terms of how logic is constructed, or how it is that we can take a meta-analytical point of view, it seems to indicate that there's something, and this is actually, funnily enough, perhaps touching on the panentheistic element or the directionality of this transjective component, but like pointing to something outside of the system that is considering it, or that is being under consideration. And so what then is that symbol if the symbol itself is potentially a self, right? Like what the hell is really going on there? And maybe that's also tying in with the compositional aspect of this, right?
That's interesting, and I don't think I quite get the question. So maybe I can ask you to, when you say that the self is a symbol, what do you mean more precisely? Like, what does the self mediate from and to exactly?
The thing that describes me, right?
Okay.
Yeah, like that is when I summon the symbol of self, it summons this notion of a vessel, of a container that is incorporating elements, right? It's this perhaps the general organizing component.
Okay, and can you remind me of the link you were trying to make between that and the ground of being?
Oh, sure, yeah. So if that thing itself, as it is being utilized in the functioning of pulling that forth, right? So that this is the self-referential aspect of it. So the physical processes in my brain here are involved in this self-assessing, self-constructing, self-whatever reference thing. So that they're what is it pointing to, right? Like that's I guess the element, but that's partially why it's cheeky, I suppose.
Yeah, but I guess I can try to. So I tend to use the symbolism of the head and the body, but you can try to use other symbolic structures as well. Jonathan really likes to use the center and the periphery, and maybe I can try to use this to talk about the symbol of the self as you describe it. Maybe this can help us make some headway there. Seems to me like the way you describe the self is, say, it's like what mediates between the world, or maybe it's what mediates between your world and your center. Like you don't have a perfect access to yourself, to your inner self. So you need some intermediates. You need a way to get at it, and to get at your center, you use the symbol of the self, which mediates between like the world you see and your deepest nature, for instance, and then you call this the self. This makes sense, you think?
Yeah, well, so that which mediates potential into actuality, right? And potential is the landscape of possibility that I see.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah. Then that makes a lot of sense, because then sort of any self is anything that does mediate between potentiality and actuality. Whenever you have a meeting of potentiality and actuality, you get something. You get a self. You get an entity that actually exists. Okay, so I think that's fair. Can you maybe try to restate your question using this?
Yeah. Okay. So we've just discovered that component of it, right? So like we've unfolded it. But so that thing in itself is a self, right?
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Right. So
whatever mediates between potential and actuality is a self. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. But so all right. So I'm really just pointing to the self-referential aspect of this, and the way that you get stuck. But I think it's like fundamentally embedded in the ground of being, because that is where it's paradoxical, right? It's where you have to bottom out, and then from that place construct.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, that's why it seems that I would agree with you that in this way you get to a kind of pantheistic sense where everything at the base bottom layer, where you can't deconstruct it any further, builds up from a place of kind of impossible paradox, whatever
Yeah.
it can, and the potential, right? And that's so
I think that's good. And in terms of Christianity, this is checked out in the idea that that the ground of being is behind both emergence and emanation. That somehow the ground of being, by being the source of the the source of the potential and the source of the actual, is to see beyond the self. Like it's a self. I should say beyond the self, in that it's beyond potential and actual. That somehow it's the origin and meeting of both. So you sort of get to a sort of trinity. It just made me think of this. I think that's cool. That was a good question, Tyler.
And it's a beautiful point you just made there, because I think that's really what Christianity captures deeply in the philosophy and the theologies, is the triality of things that we end up at.
It's really cool.
Thank you.
It's really cool. Like somehow there's this idea that let's say God the Father only really is, and you can see this in Jonathan's last conversation with John, where they touch just a bit on the nature of person, and this had a bit to do with the Trinity. The idea that a human being, we can't even really be a human being until we have to face, let's say, the potential of others. We become a self when we actualize within a network of potential people. That's where we become a self, and this is reflected in the Trinity, in the idea that what makes the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit persons is really the fact that they interact with one another. The fact that somehow what is behind the emergence, what is behind the emanation, is both. Like this meeting of potential, this meeting of the ground of potential, the ground of the actual, is a relationship. Like if you only add one of those, they wouldn't really exist. Like potential doesn't even really make sense without the actual. You just sort of get emptiness. And conversely, the actual can't really exist either unless it has potential to actualize into. So it wouldn't really exist. And of course, the meeting of both wouldn't exist either. You can't have potential and actual meeting without having both potential and actual. So you can get at the Trinity this way, where you have a ground of potential, a ground of the actual, and the meeting of the two.
Yeah. And I love the notion of the communitas, the spirit that is invoked in cooperative elements, right? Because there isn't any real geometry there per se. It is, I mean, think of, if you think of the component of the flattening of that connective tissue out across the globe, right? And the incredible way in which we're able to orchestrate our activities together and produce such profound, miraculous things in concert together that are highly abstract. It's truly a psychotechnology, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. That was cool.
We've got a little bit over. Do you have time for one or two more?
Yeah, sure. I still have maybe 30 minutes.
Okay, great. So, Struan has a follow-up question. Why not flip the combinatorial problem in reverse? Why not stipulate that it's an issue of dividing consciousness? Stipulating that space is the panpsyche, the formal cause, is a neat solution to James' objection.
Yeah, that's a solution that some people have been trying, and it's the same thing that I think the Neoplatonists were trying to get at. But you sort of get the inverse problem. It's called, within panpsychism, it's called the decombination problem. The idea of how can then one consciousness become several consciousnesses. And really the objections map onto the same thing. So it seems, and I think this points to the sort of marriage between emergence and emanation that I've been talking about here, that you can see in the Christian Neoplatonists or in Buddhism or in modern cognitive science, that if you get a real solution to the combination problem of how different consciousness can combine, you get a simultaneous solution to the decombination problem, to the problem of how different consciousness can divide. Like both the combination and the division are deeply interpenetrating and interreporting. And I think this is that's what John is getting at within cognitive science. It's what the Christian Neoplatonists were getting at 1500 years ago. And it's what I think also the Buddhists are pointing to.
All right. Dana, you have a question. Or I can read it out. What do you think of the interface theory of perception, and how that could relate to panpsychism?
Good question. It's been a while since I looked at Don Hoffman's work precisely, but I'll do my best here. I think that Don Hoffman's work is good to point out a problem if you take his assumptions, but I think where he goes wrong is when he gets to a strange conclusion where it turns out we have like no contact with the world, that we're very wrong about almost everything. And rather than looking at his hypotheses again and doubting them, he just takes that as a granted and goes to a full-blown idealism. And I don't think that's quite warranted. If I remember correctly, if you look at Don Hoffman's papers, what you'll see is that he starts off with a correspondence theory of he starts off with I think it's a representational theory of perception, where you have the world, and then within our minds we create representations of the world, and then from that he then goes on to he adds a few more hypotheses, and then he makes game theoretic simulations, and also some, I think now he also has actual probability demonstrations to show that if you start with these hypotheses, you end up with the idea that the interfaces, or you can say the representations that we have of the external world, actually have to be radically wrong. They have to be radical oversimplifications that will not even be isomorphic to the real world. So you will not, it's not only that you will sort of approximate the real world according to him, it's that the heuristics you end up with will have to be not isomorphic to the real world. And an example he uses is, let's say like the trash can on your computer screen. It's nothing like what actually happens when you delete something in your laptop. And that's the conclusion he reaches, that somehow natural selection gave us a perception that is radically disconnected from what actually goes on in the world. But I think this was almost bound to happen from his initial hypothesis, and some philosophers have been disputing this for a while, the idea that we represent the world rather than just interact in contact with it. I think there's something very, let's say maybe like what Descartes or Kant are doing in Hoffman. I think it's nice that he proves it mathematically, that if you start with the idea that we represent the world and that we're not in contact with it, then we end up with a radical separation. That's, I think, what happened from Descartes to Kant. But rather than going this way, I think you can do what the phenomenologists did, also what Henry Bergson did, and you instead say that, well, rather than us representing the world, we actually have contact with the world at let's say in terms of John's system. I think you would say that we have in one of the 4 Ps, the lowest level of the 4 Ps was I think it's the participatory. Like we can have participatory contact with reality, and from this we can build higher level perceptions that become more and more abstract and that have, let's say, more and more chance of losing contact with the world. But if you start this way, then you do not agree with Hoffman's hypothesis that we represent the world. Rather, you start with a contact, and because of this, you do not have to endorse the idealism that Don Hoffman goes to. And to answer the second part of the question, how could that relate to panpsychism? Well, you can see that even what Hoffman gets to, he gets to a sort of idealism, and you can see idealism as a subset of panpsychism. It's panpsychism, the idea that everything has mind. To some level, there are asterisks, of course, but the idea that at the fundamental level, everything is conscious. Hoffman will get there via idealism, but there are other ways to be a panpsychist, and I don't think it's the most convincing one. I think the best one is to see panpsychism as within the framework of emergence animation that we discussed earlier. Does that answer the question, Dana?
He said yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Persona, you have a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. In light of current events, I wanted to ask you about the symbolism of statues.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that there's symbols that mediate between past and future to create a community identity. So how worried should we be about this attack on statues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if you saw Jonathan's video, which he posted yesterday on this topic.
Yes, I did. I just wanted to hear a little more about it.
Yeah, but I think he got it right, where statues are physical artifacts that mediate between us and our past, that mediates between us and our common story. And it's not the only physical artifacts that do so. You can, like the flag does the same thing, or the White House in America, where you have something that's physical, that when you look at it, brings you into participation with your country, with your fellow people. So if you break down these symbols, you break down your participation into the community. So it's, what it does immediately is fragment people, and there's potential for something else to reemerge, for new symbols to reemerge. But of course, it's a time of chaos. Not only good things will probably reemerge from this. So, I mean, I guess we should be worried to some extent. We should keep our eyes open and try to look at the symbols that will emerge, try to get away from the bad ones and try to foster the good ones. So I guess we should be worried to the extent that we can. If we shouldn't be worried too much about things that we have no control over. I think, like, unless you're like unless you're in a high position of authority, there's no need to focus too much on very large stuff that you have no control over. But we should definitely keep our eyes open and try to see at the level that, to the extent that we can, what are the good symbols that we can foster from all of this mess.
No, that's a very cool idea. I like that idea of emerging possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Person.
So I wonder, JP, what do you... I'm quite partial to integrated information theory, which is, I call it sort of panpsychic light, where not every particle is conscious, but particles, when they're in the shape of information, that's in the shape of the pattern of integrated information, that's when consciousness manifests.
Yeah.
Are you? Yeah. What are your thoughts on? Or have you looked into IIT, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's another thing I looked at in the past. It's been a while, so I don't know if that has changed much since I looked at it. From what I remember, it has the advantage of being a formal description of a panpsychist theory. So I think it's good in that it allows panpsychists to test at least some of their hypotheses. So, for instance, I think they were able, within integrated information theory, to predict. I don't think they have really predicted anything new so far, but at least they can explain some things that we already see. Like, they can explain why certain neural networks are correlated with consciousness and some others are not. And if you start with so you start with a bunch of postulates that imply a form of panpsychism, as you said. It's not quite some sort of a panpsychism, and you pointed this out correctly, Brett. It's not the sort of panpsychism that starts really from the bottom down, where every particle is conscious, but somehow the information is conscious. So maybe I think it goes quite far down though. So, for instance, the fact that an electron can have spin up or spin down means that the electron contains some information, and because of that, I do think that it means that they're the electron is conscious within integrated information theory. But I'm not sure. I would have to look at it. It's been a while. But the point is just that with all of their hypotheses, their postulates, they can predict a bunch of stuff. It predicts panpsychism, among other things. It can also have real testable hypotheses. I don't think they have anything new so far, but the fact that they can explain things that already exist, I think, is encouraging. It's good for Theism to have some empirically testable predictions. So I think it's one. I think that other formal panpsychist theories will also emerge over time. Even we mentioned Don Hoffman's interface theory of perception, and that's another formal rendering of panpsychism. I mean, it's an idealism that is also a panpsychism, and I know that they are working on trying to get some empirically testable predictions from it. So I think those are like steps in the good direction. Of course, there would be philosophical things I would dispute in both IIT and the interface theory of perception. But still, I'm quite happy to see that people are developing empirically testable versions of panpsychism. Does that help, Brett?
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much, JP. This has been just a great talk.
Yeah.
And
thank you for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for participating. It was a great experience.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and make sure everyone to log on to our Google Calendar, which you can find linked in the pinned post in the announcements channel. We've got all sorts of activities going on, so every day we've got different things going on, and we're adding more and more. So please take a look and be here for see what you're interested in. So again, thank you, JP. That was amazing. And thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.